Welcome back everyone to part 2 of the Weaver Ant Terrarium. This is for my dream ant colony, Polyrhachis dives, although they're more commonly known as golden weaver ants or lesser weaver ants. If you haven't seen part 1 yet, then go check that out first. Last week we installed all the necessary hardware, namely a frosted background, heating and lighting. We also created a drainage layer and added all the substrate in. We also experimented with many different orientations of spiderwood and secured them into place with super glue and moss until we ended up with this here now. Today I'll be planting it and adding some smaller details, and then later on I'll also add the ants. This has been quite a busy project, so without further ado, let's get right into it. I've got quite a few different plants to work with, so I'll list them as and when they're used. As always, I rinse the roots off of all the soil before planting them. I'll be planting larger plants first, and further back. I began with the Calathea. It has large round leaves that provide excellent cover below. Moving on, I have another Calathea. This one has a purple undertone to the leaves, which are narrower than the previous one, providing a nice contrast. Whilst planting, I kept having to remind myself that I had to leave enough room for the ants to weave. As you might have guessed, I'll be using plenty of Fittonias. Along with the white variant, I also have some pink ones, but this will be a detail, so they'll be added later. Smaller plants are added further forward to make it feel more natural. As I mentioned in part 1, I want this to look good from all 3 directions. Because of this, I made sure to include some plants to the sides. It's time to bring some colour to this scape. First of all, I'm adding some pink Fittonias. These have a really tropical vibe to them. They're added in various places to bring pops of colour to the dual island composition of the wood. I was pleased with it at this point, but I wasn't completely satisfied. It felt dark in places, so I added a vibrant Boston fern to lighten it up. They have much more vivid leaves than the other plants, again adding intrigue. Now for a final few touches, I'll be adding an air plant on the large piece of wood. It could simply be pushed into a crevice and the base was filled with sphagnum moss. There's a pink colour to its leaves, which matches with the Fittonias. A tiny little air plant was added on one of the branches using superglue. I added a few more Fittonias and Calatheas in places that looked a bit empty. With this, the planting was complete. That took quite a while, but I'm not finished just yet. I'm happy with how it's all planted, although I might add a few smaller detail plants later on. The next thing I want to address is the foreground and sides. I'm thinking of using either coarse black sand or something similar, but I'll see what works as I go along. I'm also going to incorporate moss and cocoa fibre to give the ants more materials to weave from. I know I just said I'd use black gravel, but I decided to go against this and use a bright white instead, the same as the drainage layer. This will really help with the design pulp. Although the gravel I'm using here is too large and I'll end up swapping it out, but more on that soon. I created a path that got narrower the further back it went. This helps create depth. There are a few voids under the wood that are unsightly, so I filled them in using dry sphagnum moss. This also gives the ants places to weave. Moving on to the exposed soil, I wasn't a fan of how it was looking, so I scattered lots of cocoa fibres on it to soften the transition. Now for the thing that will really make it look natural, leaf litter. I'm using oak leaves with a few smaller various types mixed in. It was added mainly on the sides as I want the path to stay fairly clean, for the time being at least. I'm really happy with how it's looking. It just has this jungly feel to it and I can't wait to get the colony in. But this will have to wait. I want to add a dedicated cleanup crew now, and then I'll give the terrarium a few days to settle in before adding the colony. This will help me spot any issues that might pop up and deal with them, although I'm not expecting any. I've got a few isopods that I want to put in, so let's bring some life to the terrarium. Before this though, there was something I needed to address, the path. After a day of contemplating, I knew that I had to change the gravel. The fragment sizes were just too large and were taking away from the scape. I also thought they were too bright against the darker style. So I painstakingly removed all of it. It took a while, but looking back now it was definitely worth the effort. Instead, I'm using a much finer Hugo Kamishi gravel. It looks quite bright now, but once sprayed down the colour becomes more neutral and natural and really complements the other components. However, I did use some of the larger gravel as accent points to add variation to the path, especially around the edges. I replaced the roots and added a few small leaves on the path. I also added another smaller air plant to the piece of wood on the right to balance the two sides and complete the scape. Now, as I mentioned, I want to add various isopods to clean up the ants' waste. I expect them to do well, although I'm not sure how the weaver ants will react to them. I'll let nature's course take place in this terrarium. I went through my isopod bins and settled on the species on screen now. Pouring them in, and very quickly they ran off in all directions. For the next few hours they'll be very much out in the open exploring this space, but after this period they should be much more secretive and I won't see them that often. They'll keep the terrarium running smoothly and might become a tasty snack for the colony every now and again. It doesn't show on camera very much, but in person there's a bit of a glare on the wood from the light as it's a little on the bright side. The easiest way to fix this is to cover up some of the LEDs with black electrical tape. With this done, the terrarium is all complete. It's been just under a week since they added the isopods, and the terrarium's going great. I've not seen any mould or any other issues that might cause a problem, so I should be all good to add the ants. Up to this point, I've not really shown or talked about the ants, so let's do that first. They're currently housed in a small plastic tub that I've modified for their needs. Originally this was for a tarantula, but since then I've plugged the ventilation holes with cotton wool and drilled a hole in the side so I can have a thermometer probe inside to monitor the conditions. It's not very pretty, but it's done well as a temporary setup. Now for the colony. I 3D printed two parts to cover their test tubes at all times, although since then they've actually moved out of these and began to weave on the second piece. You can see the silk here. The nests the girls make are awesome, and I can't wait to see them undergo nest building in their new space. There's also plenty of brood. You can see some cocoons here. As some of you may be wondering, I should mention how I stop the ants crawling out. I use Fluon, which when dry is super slippery for the ants and they can't cross it. As this species are quite good climbers, I'll add a fairly wide barrier. I applied it with a paintbrush. It's not the prettiest of things, but it is necessary. It's finally time to add the ants. I lowered them into their new lands. Sorry everyone for the cliffhanger, but this video is getting quite long and I've got a lot I want to say whilst adding the ants. I also don't want to rush the video editing, and the quality will be much better with a third part. I hope you enjoyed the second instalment of this project, and please consider checking out my Patreon and subscribing to see part 3 next week. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time to add the ants.